in the Department of Computational and Neuroscience. Before that, he spent around 8 years at Berkeley working at Jack Lab, first as a PhD student and then as a postdoc, where he focused on using modern computation methods to understand how the brain extracts meaning from both vision and language. And today he's going to talk to us about how to do map representations of language semantics in human cortex. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Javier. Y'all can hear me okay? All right, super. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about some of the work I've done on especially using natural language to map representations of language meaning in human cortex, and also some more recent work that we've done on sort of matching this between language and visual representations, and I hope you find it interesting. So the big question that a lot of my work is addressing is, how do we understand language? We take in these words that are just a sequence of mouth flapping sounds that somebody else makes, come into our brains, and they become an idea. Right? You get this idea that forms out of words that can be very multimodal. You can have pictures as part of ideas. You can have sort of geometric concepts. You can have mathematical concepts. You can have smells. You can have tastes. You can have all these things mixed together in an idea. So how does this process work? Parts of the brain involved in this? It turns out a lot. And sort of, can we model this computationally? It's kind of the big question that we're trying to ask here, and we definitely don't come close to answering that question, but I hope I can show you that we are able to answer some parts of this. So before I really dive into showing you data, I want to show you visualized data. Many of you are absolutely on the cutting edge of fMRI and fMRI data visualization, but I'm going to be showing you a lot of data that is in flattened cortical maps, which you may not be useful to, or you may not be used to looking at. So I want to kind of help people get equilibrated. So this is your standard anatomical scan. We start with a T1 anatomical. We reconstruct the surface using standard tools, FreeSurfer. We inflate the surface. We make relaxation cuts into the medial wall of the surface, and then we flatten the entire cortical surface out so that we can see the cortex in one fell swoop, in one two-dimensional image. Like I said, many of you are probably familiar with this, but just to sort of reacclimate you, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. In the back of the brain here in the middle, we have visual cortex. So we've outlined ROIs that we've localized in separate experiments on this subject in white. So we have a lot of like the renotopic ROIs you might recognize here, V1 through V4. We have higher level visual areas scattered around the edge of visual cortex. We have auditory cortex here in the temporal lobe. This is the Sylvian fissure. This is the somatomotor strip. This is the central focus right here. So we have the mouth, hand, and foot areas localized, and a few premotor areas, and things on the hand side. This is the way I'm going to be visualizing all this data. Now let me show you kind of what this data looks like before we talk about how we're going to model it. So I do a very different kind of experiment than many of the experiments that you see in standard like cognitive psychology. Cognitive neuroscience talks. We're just going to use, instead of sort of having a defined hypothesis before we start the experiment, we're going to expose the natural stimuli, in this case, natural stories. We're going to have people listen to naturally spoken narrative stories. And then we're going to try to build models of how the brain is processing or representing this information post. But let me show you what this data looks like, so you can get a taste of that. So here I'm showing another flattened cortex. It's a different subject, but the same idea. And here I've colored each voxel according to its z-scored response across this section of stimulus. So blue voxels have sort of lower than average response at this point in time, and red voxels have higher than average response at this point in time. I'm going to be showing you about 45 seconds of stimuli here. This is actually composed of a few different snippets together that we did as a test set, but in the actual experiment, people heard 10 to 15-minute stories, like all in one fell swoop instead of snippets. But the game that we're going to try to play now is you'll see and hear the stimulus playing out on the right-hand side here, and you'll see the brain activity evolving over here. And the game that we're going to try to play is, let's look at the stimulus let's look at the words that are appearing or listen for the words that are appearing, and then try to map that to what's happening in the brain. So we're going to try to just build in our heads now models that go from stimulus to the response. So let's see how easy this is.
What a crazy world we're bringing our children into. He thought it sounded like the kind of statement that brings people closer together, pointing as it did to their common fate. But the sexy mom just glared at him and took the healthy living supplement, too, without asking.
He put Lilia in charge of the party while he was gone, and then he walked downstairs. There must have been 5,000 people milling around, wrapped in furs or long overcoats or ski parkas or leather jackets, high school, college kids, heavily champagne 60-year-olds, linking arms and singing.
Only the two front windows with white shades lowered were not somehow blanketed. Your eye was constantly drawn to where the material converged mid-ceiling, punctured by a dazzling pink spotlight that looked like it might have just vaporized a flamingo. See?
All right, so this is tricky. I've stared at this a lot. I've stared at this kind of thing for longer than is probably reasonable. It's really hard to see any relationship between the words that are appearing here and the responses that are happening in the brain, but that's what we're going to ask our computational models to do. How do we do this? How do we attack this problem? So this is the experiment that we're doing. The framework that we use is something that I think we developed or pushed in for the last slightly more than a decade, starting with Peter Kay's work in 2008. And it all kind of follows the same path. It looks like this. So we take a natural stimulus, which might be, well, in this case, it's naturally spoken narrative stories, but it might be natural images or natural movies. We play them for our subject. We record fMRI data. And we take these stimuli, and we project them into some hypothesized feature space. We extract features from the stimuli using some computational model. And this is the first place where a hypothesis comes into this data. In this top stream going from stimulus to fMRI data, there's no hypothesis embedded in this experiment. There's no hypothesis in the experimental design itself. We're just recording responses to natural stimuli. Right? But then when we extract features, we're forming a hypothesis, right? We're forming, we're asking whether these specific features that we're extracting are something that's represented in the brain. So we take stimuli, we extract features from them, and then using the fMRI data and the hypothesized features, we're going to first estimate voxel-wise regression. And this is just fitting relatively large-scale linear regression models. We're going to predict the response in each voxel as a function of the features that we've extracted from the stimuli. Okay, so this is the first stage in this estimation. The second stage, we go back and the same subjects. We take new natural stimuli that the subject hasn't seen before and the model hasn't seen before. We play them for our subjects and we record new fMRI data. We project these new stimuli into the same hypothesized feature space using the same transform. And then we use the regression models that we fit previously in now to do prediction in order to predict these new fMRI data. So for each voxel, we now get a predicted time course that is how that voxel should respond according to this model over time to this new stimulus. This is testing out of set stimulus data, which is kind of a nice like gold standard for predictive of activity. Right? If you can predict responses to natural stimuli, then you know that you're doing a good job. So that's what we're testing explicitly here. Now, if this does a good job, the models do well at predicting the brain responses, then we can ask what is it about the stimulus that's actually driving the response in any one feature. We can go in and start to interrogate these voxel-wise regression models and try to interpret what it is, which specific features are actually driving the response in any voxels in the brain. I'm going to show you an example of this as well. Okay, so this is the basic framework for how we're going to do this work. Let me tell you how I do this specifically for this data. And I'm going to start with kind of a straw man model that is, we're going to replace it with a much better model as we go. Okay, so a really simple model that we could fit for this data is that each voxel responds some amount to each word. This is saying that like each word, like table or penguin, each voxel has some amount that it responds to that word. Every time you hear the word penguin, each little piece of your brain is either going to not respond at all, or it's going to increase its response a little bit, or decrease its response a little bit. That's what this is saying. So represented mathematically, we have for each voxel this response time course, R of t. We're representing that as, we're modeling it as weighted sum of these word indicator variables. So this is Wi of t is a 1 when that word is present and a 0 when the word is not present. And the betas now are the weights. These are the things that we have to estimate, right? We know R, we record the brain responses. We know exactly when every word was spoken in the stories, and we know what all the words are because we just went in and annotated all that. And then fitting the model is just estimating these betas. And we're going to do that using, I'm framing this in a sort of Bayesian framework here because I'm going to use that in a moment. But this is just linear regression, right? We're trying to maximize the probability of the observed response given the weights and the stimulus, which is the word indicator here. And that gives us this beta hat that is our estimated weights, the weights that work well. Okay, so we do this procedure. In this case, sorry I didn't tell you how many stimuli we have. We had each subject listen to 10 stories. Each one is between 10 and 15 minutes long. This ends up being just a little over 2 hours and, I don't know, 5 minutes of data, something like that, for each subject. For training and then for testing, we have a separate 10-minute story that each subject listened to a couple times, and then we average the responses. So we're going to train this model on the 2 hours and a little bit of training data, and then test it on the held-out 10-minute story. For each voxel, we're going to compute the correlation between the predicted and the actual responses. All right, that looks like this. So this is showing the prediction performance of this word indicator sort of simple model across one subject's brain. The voxels that are not significantly predicted are shown in gray, and this is a reasonably liberal significance threshold. The correlation for better voxels is shown in this hot, with the yellow or white voxels being quite well predicted and red voxels being pretty poorly predicted. And what you can see is that we do a reasonable job in some areas. So we have, in sort of higher auditory cortex, we do quite well. So this is lateral auditory cortex, superior temporal cortex, and virus in both hemispheres. In sort of posterior parietal cortex, we do quite well, all along this stretch of cortex right here and into inferior temporal cortex. In parts of prefrontal cortex, especially around Broca's area, which is here, we do quite well. But this is not really this is not great performance. How can we improve this model? I told you that this was kind of the straw man model that we were going to knock down. So how can we make this model better? So I may have given you a hint earlier on, but one of the things that I'm really interested in is the meaning of language. How the meaning of language is represented in brain activity. So this model has no idea that words have meanings. It has no idea that some words have related meanings and some words have very different meanings. So let's add that in as a hint to this model and see if it can do a better job. So this is the sort of second generation model. Let's call this the semantic model. And what it's going to say instead is that we expect to see similar responses to words with similar meanings. For instance, words like month, week, and hour all relate to spans of time. So we expect that if a voxel responds strongly to the word month, then it might also respond strongly to the words week and hour. Similarly for words like park presentation or woman, boy, and child. Okay, so this is a semantic prior for this model. Instead of just fitting a separate weight for each word, where we're independently estimating sort of how the brain responds to each individual word, we're adding some information in that says, okay, these words are related and they should have similar weights. How do we get this semantic prior? How do we know which words have related meanings? We're going to pull on a technique from, or sort of an idea from computational linguistics that is now quite old, called the distributional hypothesis. Commonly stated as you shall know a word by the company it keeps. The basic idea is that you can look at how words are used. Specifically, you can look at the context in which words often appear, and then use that to guess which words have related meanings. So that's actually what we're kind of showing here. So it turns out that the words month and week often occur in similar texts. They often occur around similar other words, and that's why we assign them a high over here. I don't want to talk about the details of exactly how we construct this model. You can ask me about that later if you're interested. But this is the basic kernel of the idea. So we're looking at properties of words across a large corpus of English text. We take a couple billion words of English text from a scrape of Wikipedia, plus a bunch of books, plus a bunch of other crap that's thrown in there, and we just count which words appear to other words, and then it becomes our model of word similarity. All right. To incorporate this into our encoding model, into this voxel prediction, we're going to add this as a prior into the regression step. And this is why I used the Bayesian framing for the model weights earlier. So now instead of just finding the weights that maximize this likelihood function, that's the probability of response given the weights and the stimuli, we're going to find the weights that maximize the product of this likelihood function with a prior function that's given by the word similarities that we computed using the distributional method. Okay? So what this prior will do is it would assign high probability to sets of weights where they obey the prior, right? So it'll assign a high probability to a set of weights where month, week, weights for month and week are similar, and a low probability to weights where month and week are very different. Right? So it'll bias the results, bias the resulting the argmax over betas here to look more like this prior than it would otherwise. All right, so we can fit this model. Turns out this is essentially boils down to a ridge regression model that we can fit using standard techniques. Test it in the same way that we tested the other model. We can just how well we can predict these new stimuli, the responses to new stimuli. A caveat here. This may have a flavor of representational analysis. This is not representational analysis. We have a paper coming out at some point where we're really detailing like the differences between this approach and RSA, and we think that there are actually pretty fundamental problems with RSA. That RSA makes very fundamental assumptions about the distribution of weights across being wrong in the vast majority of cases. Sorry, this is just an aside, but I wanted to point out. Okay, so we can use this model to predict the brain data. It turns out that it works much, much, much better than our model that assumed that those were independent. So this is the prediction performance using our new model. We get great predictions throughout this sort of edge of occipital cortex here, really throughout parietal cortex, throughout a lot of prefrontal cortex, both hemispheres. Precuneus is remarkably well predicted. Let me flip back and forth. So this is the word model that was the one that I showed you previously, and this is the semantic model. And you can see that there's a huge difference in terms of prediction performance, in terms of like which areas are. Okay, so because all these voxels, this is just showing this 3, because all these voxels are much better predicted model that incorporates semantic information, assumes that words that have similar meanings, similar responses in brain activity. What we infer from this is that these brain areas actually respond to the meaning of the words and not to the surface form or other properties of the words. So these areas represent meaning in language. This can be a sticky inference, but I think it's kind of key to what's happening here. Okay. Kind of the first 2 stages here. We've looked at prediction, we've estimated voxel-wise regression models, and we've looked at prediction performance of those models, and we see that they are reasonably good at predicting brain activity across really big hunks. So let's dig into these models and see if we can figure out what is making each of these areas tick. Put differently, what information is represented in each voxel? Okay, so we can look at a single voxel. This is one voxel in of one subject. It's a very well predicted voxel, and we can look at the weights for this voxel, just in terms of like which words have very positive weights, which words have very negative weights. I gave this talk in front of my wife once, and she called this the Thanksgiving dinner voxel, which I thought was very clever. So it really does not like when you talk about politics or religion, but it likes, if you were going to talk about how long your commute is or something like that, it's a safe topic, and this voxel responds to that very positively. But you can see that it responds to numbers, it responds to directions, sort of spatial something, and definitely not to these more abstract words like politics or religion or anger or biology, culture, or so on. But this is not incredibly clear. This is kind of hard to figure out exactly what this voxel is doing, and it's hard to know, how robust these precise weights are to the details of how we fit this model or exactly which stimuli we included in this experiment and so on. So, this is just one voxel that we're trying to interpret out of thousands of well-predicted voxels in this one subject, and this is just one subject out of like 7 subjects that we scanned for this experiment. So how do we get a handle on this information in a more easy to grasp way? So I'm going to skip a few steps here, but the long and short of it is that we're going to use principal components analysis to reduce the dimensionality of the models down to just 3 dimensions that shared across subjects. And then we're going to visualize. So now this converts each voxel was the many thousand dimensional weight vector that we fit for that voxel. We're going to convert that into just 3 numbers that capture broadly what that voxel is selected for. Principal components explain something like 15, 20% of the total variance, but it goes. And then we can represent these 3 numbers as a color because they come to red, green, and blue color components. Turn each voxel into a color that has some meaning to us. That's what this looks like. So here I've colored each voxel according to its projection on the 3 PCs. And right here I'm giving legends of what the different kind of mean, what at least the first 2 principal components are. So briefly, it seems like the space of the first 2 PCs, it kind of spans 2 axes that are not quite aligned with the principal components themselves. The first axis broadly goes in this direction, seems to span from kind of social, emotional things to perceptual things, visual, tactile, placing things. Then the alternate axis here, the orthogonal axis, seems to span from in this corner, and it's hidden here because I reduced this down to just a few clusters in order to show it clearly. But things that are both social and both kind of social and perceptual end up in the top right corner here. So we get words for violence, and one of the things that didn't come out as a cluster here, but shows up if you look at the individual words, is words for body parts. It's upper quadrant here, so it's both something you can sort of see and touch and interact with, and something that is social, that's related to sort of how you relate to other people. And then down in the bottom left corner here, we find things that are kind of neither perceptual nor social. For instance, words that relate to time, which is not really something that you can touch and perceive, but it's also not something that's related to how you socialize with other people. So that's kind of the space that's discovered here. And you can see that these areas that were well predicted by this model, they're essentially the colorful ones here. They're not homogeneous. They're not all selected for the same thing. They're selected for lots of different things. They kind of tiled with small areas that represent different kinds of stuff. We have, along especially in the parietal cortex, lateral parietal cortex, we have this big ring of perceptual representations that has different properties along it, but is largely in that end of the space. And in the center of it is this patches of different sort of social-like representations. In prefrontal cortex, we see this pretty complex map of different kinds of representations that really tiles most of prefrontal cortex. And one thing that I didn't comment on before, but was a kind of surprising result from this data. So the model performance, you might have noticed, is actually pretty consistent between the 2 hemispheres. Like we don't see big lateralization effects in model performance. Left hemisphere and right hemisphere, pretty much we can predict them equally well to each other, and it turns out that there's no statistical difference across the subjects that we tested. There are differences in semantic selectivity, however. So you can see that, for instance, the hemisphere here has a lot more of this bright green color, which is sort of far out on this perception. And this is the subject that is maybe most asymmetric in this sense, but that's vaguely consistent across subjects. Let me show you a couple more subjects. Okay, so here's now 3 subjects. On the top, we have whole brain shown in 3D, and on the bottom, we have a flat map for each subject that is a sphere. So you can see that a lot of these patterns that we saw in the example subject, which is the one on the right here. Oops, I should not point with the mouse while this is playing. Okay. Go away. Come on. You're not. Okay. There we go. Apologies to anyone who can't see this laser pointer, but a lot of the patterns that we saw on the right-hand side here are pretty apparent in the other subjects as well, even kind of small detailed things. So there's a tiny purple patch right here in the top of the lateral parietal cortex that is recapitulated in each subject. There's a little brown patch here that's in the back of the lateral parietal cortex that's recapitulated in each subject. There's a pattern of little green spots in the prefrontal cortex that is not identical across subjects, but at least they're there. Like the same areas seem to be there in all these subjects, even if they're not in precisely the same anatomical locations. Okay, so these maps end up quite similar across people and quite widespread. So we can take away from this that a pretty large fraction of the brain is actually responding to information in language, which I think is kind of unsurprising in a way, that we use a lot of the sort of different cognitive components that we have in our brains to understand language, because language uses those cognitive components, right? When you hear someone talk about places that they've been or navigating through a space, the parts of your brain that are involved in navigation and place processing will turn on. When you hear somebody talking about numbers, or, I was there 3 years ago, but 2 years ago I did this, then parts of your brain that respond to numbers and kind of mathematical reasoning, they turn on. So what we're seeing here, I think, is really that kind of level of language grabbing onto all these different cognitive modules that we have at our disposal. That's why I think it's also kind of interesting to use language as a tool to study cognition in general, that we can use just this natural language stimulus to get a hold on all of these different brain areas that are doing different cognitive tasks. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk about a slightly different experiment. Yeah, a question? It actually, among the first few principal components, it doesn't. And this is something that I've really noticed is different between if you do PCA on raw, like brain responses, you always get massively artifactual components in there somewhere. You get like a movement component or like a visual component or something like that. They show up in the first few dimensions because those are huge sources of variance. But because we're doing PCA on the model weights here, we've already pre-filtered for essentially variance that is explainable by the stimulus. So because we filter down from like all the variance in the fMRI data to only that part that we can explain through this model of the stimulus, what we end up with is something that is seemingly much cleaner. Yeah, another question? No, so this was just people had their eyes closed, listening to the stories over headphones. So you did it the opposite way, just have them reading. We do. Let me show you what that looks like very briefly, because I just happen to have this slide. So this paper was just accepted at Journal of Neuroscience. Which one is which? It's hard to tell. Top one is listening. Bottom one is reading for the same subject, reading the same stories and listening to the same stories. They're stunningly similar. You can see that there's a little bit of difference in, you get more sort of early auditory cortex in the listening and more sort of early visual cortex in the reading. They have high SNR. And so you can explain a little bit of variance with the semantic model, but broadly, these are incredibly similar between the two modalities. Okay, let me back to where I was. All right, so one question that I've been really interested in after seeing all this data and having worked a lot with sort of high-level visual models in the past, is how do these representations relate to the representations that you get of visual stimuli, right? So this is a classical question. You see a picture of a dog, or you hear the word dog, something happens in your brain in either case. How related are these two things? Are they the same? Are there components that are different? What does the relationship look like? This is not a new question. A lot of people have asked this question. There have been a lot of papers on exactly this topic. But I thought, hey, we already had the data for this. It turns out that we had kind of got lucky, and from this old experiment where we had people watch movies and we'd labeled all the things in the movies, there was a pretty decent overlap between the subject pool that had taken part in this movie experiment and the subjects who had taken part in our language experiment. So I thought, hey, let's just compare them. Right? So yeah, for this movie experiment, subjects stayed on the center of the screen, watching movies for about 2 hours. It's a tough experiment to be a subject for. Unlike the language experiment, which is like the most fun experiment that I've ever been a subject for, it's really enjoyable to just close your eyes and listen to a podcast. It turns out that's what we do all the time anyway. Do it in the scanner, it's fine. But okay, so we had an overlap of about 5 subjects between these studies. And we thought, let's look at this and see what comes out of this. This ends up being, even though we only had about 2 hours of usable sort of functional data from each subject, this ends up being about 15 hours in the scanner for each subject, doing all the localizers and so on. The cool thing is that we can treat these 2 experiments as almost exactly the same thing. So what we do is we take the movie data, and we know we had a single annotator, which was me, go through all the movies and label all the nouns and verbs that are in every second of the movies. And now we can treat those almost as if they're stories, right? So just in each second of the movie, we have a bunch of words, and we just say it's like you're listening to a story where you hear, a collection of 15 words every second or something like that. It's a little bit faster rate than the stories, but it's still comparable. And then we can push them through exactly the same model. So we can form them into the space that's given by this distributional word technique, and then fit encoding models to the movie data and fit encoding models to the language data. And they're in exactly the same space. We have the same number of weights per voxel in cases, and now we can compare them directly and see if there's anything new or exciting. Okay, so we did this, and I did the first analysis that came to mind that I thought was the most obvious one, which was just for each voxel, compute the correlation between its selectivity in the movies and its selectivity in the stories. Right? Straightforward. This is showing voxels that have positive correlation between their weights in the movies and the stories. Turns out we see vaguely this kind of rim around the edge of occipital cortex, a little bit in precuneus, a little bit in temporal cortex, a little bit scattered through prefrontal cortex. If you look at the literature, this is pretty much what everyone else has seen. There's been a half dozen papers on this topic in the last few years. Every time there's a new analysis technique, people go in and see the same results again, which is that you have a scattering of areas, especially in sort of lateral occipitotemporal cortex, that respond to both the picture of a thing and the word for a thing. People do this with analyses 10, 15 years ago. They started doing it with RSA like 5 or 10 years ago, and they've done it with like PA, and everything the same result of having these areas of overlap. Okay, but then we noticed something. So I was playing around with, so this is a web-based viewer for the language data that y'all should check out if you're interested. If you go to gallantlab.org/Huth2016, you can see this 3D viewer. You can move the brain around and click on voxels and see what they're selected for. So I was playing around with this, and I was looking specifically at the parahippocampal place area right here. This is a kind of weird view of the brain. What you're seeing is this is the left temporal lobe, and we're looking kind of up at the bottom of the brain. This is the right hemisphere. This is the left PPA, and I noticed that there are voxels in the PPA that are selective for kind of concepts, words in the language study here that you would expect to see in PPA. So this voxel, for instance, responds to, there's a bunch of time words here, but there's also words like visit, trip, downtown, parking, Denver, airport, visitors, campus, bus. It's like, these are all kind of place-like words. This is related vaguely to the kinds of things that we would expect to see in PPA. But we only saw this in kind of the anterior edge of PPA. Notice that the posterior part of PPA, the colors that it has here are very different. It does not seem to respond to these words in remotely the same kind of way. So we thought this is weird. Let's dig deeper into this and figure out what's going on. So I did a targeted analysis that was just looking at place concepts, how they're represented. And that came out looking like this. So what I did here was, for each voxel, I took a selection of place words, words that are related to places. I predicted how each voxel would respond to those words using the visual model and using the language model. So this is using the data from the movies and using the data from the stories. And then I plotted them here on this 2D color map. So voxels that are black respond to places in neither condition. Voxels that are red only respond to visually presented places. Voxels that are blue only respond to place words. And voxels that are white respond to both visual and language places. And what we see is this pretty interesting pattern. So around, there's 3 classical place areas, the RSC, OPA, and PPA. We see these in both hemispheres in this subject. And what we kind of see is that there's this pretty local gradient that appears from red in the posterior part of each area, the part that's closer to occipital cortex, white in the middle, to blue in the anterior part outside the area. Right? Red to white to blue, red to white to blue, red, white, blue, blue. Seems to show up in each of these areas. What this is it's a gradient from voxels that are purely selective for visual stimulation, to a selection of voxels that are mixed, that respond to both visual and language, to voxels that only respond to language. And this is kind of exciting, because this was something that there had been hints of in the past. There have certainly been studies that have argued that as you go anterior across the temporal lobe, that you go from representations more concrete to representations of more abstract categories. But this is a very local effect that happens within about 1 centimeter and within each of these high-level visual areas. We see this very localized effect of modality shift, we're calling it. So it turns out this is pretty consistent across subjects. This is another collection of subjects where we see more or less the same pattern in every case where we can find the areas. At least there's one where we don't have no. Same thing appears. It turns out that this is also consistent for different categories. So we see it also for words related to bodies, close to the EBA, and words related to faces, close to the fusiform face area, the FFA. We see the same kind of red to white to blue pattern here. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, and there's a grad student in Jack's lab who's done a ton of nice work showing that this is actually a general property, that you can look at any location along the edge of visual cortex, you see the same pattern for whatever category is represented there. You get a shift from purely visual representation to representation to purely language representation. So we take this as kind of evidence that the visual and language cortex, we consider them as forming a single sort of contiguous cortical map, where you have representation of the same semantic category over some space, but local change in modality that is receptive to. Question? So we do see some gradients in frontal areas, but they're not as consistent across subjects. Yeah, I can't really say much about that. Yeah. So we thought that this could be kind of interesting because maybe this could help explain why language cortex is organized like this, right? Why is selectivity for these words in these different places in cortex, and why is this so consistent across people? Maybe it's actually being patterned off of visual cortex. Maybe visual cortex is driving the nearby pieces of cortex to be selective for those. And we're currently trying to repeat this experiment in congenitally blind subjects to see if that helps answer this question. Don't have results for it yet, but that's an exciting upcoming thing. preliminary results kind of suggest that actually blind subjects look remarkably similar in how their language cortex is organized, so it's probably not visual cortex that's driving all of this, but it might be driving some. All right. I want to briefly tell you about one more thing here. So when we fit these, this is a sort of newer direction of work that we've been doing in the lab. When we fit these models, we've been using these distributional semantic models, right, where we infer what words mean and how word meanings are related based on how words are used in text. Okay? But that's not really how humans learn about concepts. Right? We don't learn about all concepts from reading or just listening to people. We have grounding. We have visual information coming in. We also have information from many other senses, right? But there's been a long string of work arguing that the grounded properties of conceptual representations are really fundamental to how those representations formed in our brains. It's fundamental to how things are represented, that we don't represent sort of a concept independently of sensory information that's related to that concept. Right? So when you think about an apple, maybe part of understanding the concept of an apple is what an apple looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like to bite into an apple. When you think about a dog, maybe part of that is not just the sort of platonic concept of a dog, but what a dog looks like, what it feels like to pet a dog, and so on. So how can we incorporate this kind of idea into our models? So we have some preliminary work on this. Basic idea is so instead of getting sort of the word relationships or word meaning similarities from how words are used in text, we're going to guess which words are related to each other based on which words correspond to similar things. Right? So the way we do this is we take a bunch of images that correspond to individual words, and we get these from ImageNet. We push these images through a pre-trained object recognition neural network, in this case VGG16, which is a standard neural network that's trained to distinguish different object categories. And then from this network, we get a sort of high-dimensional representation of each image, and we can evaluate the similarity of those representations between categories, right? So we have a bunch of dog images and a bunch of images. We project high-dimensional space using this neural network, and then we can take the average sort of dog image vector, average cat image vector, and compute similarity between those. All right. Now, this serves as a different source of word similarity than the distributional sort of word use metric that we were using before. And adding on to this, we can actually combine this visually grounded representation with the distributional representation, or the purely visual representation with the distributional one to get visually grounded semantic space or joint semantic space, and that's what I'll be showing you results from. So, you know, there's some words that we don't have visual information for, so we essentially have to pull information from our distributional model. So I want to give a little bit of intuition for what these spaces look like and how they differ, and I hope this is slightly helpful. This is a new demo. So what I've done here is just pulled out a selection of words from two different categories, and I'm showing them in distributional space. So this is in the word space that's given by looking at how words are related based on how they're used. In the sort of blue-green color is a bunch of words that are people, words that describe people. We have man, woman, girl, boy, mother, father, doctor, child, teacher, athlete, worker, engineer in this blue-green color. And you can see that in the distributional space, they're quite broadly distributed. The dots behind here are a little hard to see, but they pretty much span this dimension of this space. And this is, this is just PCA on the distributional vectors that we have. In pink are words that describe different items of clothing. So we have socks, shoes, shirt, shorts, jeans, vest, jacket, boots, wallet, pocket, etc. And these are quite tightly clustered in the distributional space because they're all functionally similar. They're all, we talk about pieces of clothing in kind of similar ways, whereas we talk about people in quite different ways, right? The context in which you use the word near are quite different than the context in which you use the word. So this is what these things look like in the distributional space. But if we look in the visual space, we see something quite different. The same kind of visualization for the visual space. Here, all the person words kind of collapsed. So they kind of have merged into a much smaller cluster because it turns out that even though you use the words doctor and man and engineer and athlete and woman in like different contexts, they all look similar. People are people. So they all kind of come together in this space, whereas the clothing words are now more spread out, right? So now we have this more broad distribution of clothing words because different clothing actually look quite different. So that's a sort of illustration of what the differences are between the visually grounded space and the distributional space. So we can fit models using both of these different methods. We can fit these encoding models as we did before. And what I'm showing you here is a comparison of prediction performance for one subject using these two different models. So black voxels are poorly predicted by both models. White voxels are well predicted by both models, and you can see that a lot of these voxels are white. Red voxels are better predicted by the visually grounded model than the distributional model, which is the same. Distributional model is the same as the semantic model I showed you before. And blue voxels are better predicted by the distributional model than the visually grounded model. And what you can see is that there seem to be a higher proportion of these red voxels in areas that are closer to visual cortex. Among the sort of well-predicted voxels of visual cortex, there are quite a few red voxels. There are also red voxels scattered around in other places, but prefrontal cortex appears to be slightly more blue on average than red. We can see that it's close to these areas. We see a lot more of these that are better predicted by the visually grounded model. If we look at performance of these two different models in voxels that are near each of these ROIs, what we see is that there's a significantly increased model performance for the visually grounded model, although it's a small difference, near most of the visual ROIs. So this is selecting all voxels within like a of visual ROIs. Whereas if we look at non-visual ROIs, these are both speech-defined ROIs. In prefrontal cortex, we don't see the same effect at all. And interestingly, and this is kind of feeding into this question of abstract versus concrete representation again, using these models, so now we can look at what the weights look like for, here I'm just taking one concrete word and then one abstract word that's the nearest neighbor of the concrete word that is not in our sort of visual set. This is the words classroom and education. And the classroom responsive voxels are in red, voxels both are in white, and voxels that respond more to education are in blue. And what we can see is that there appears to be something like a gradient across, here it's sort of lateral parietal cortex, from more concrete representation closer to occipital cortex to more abstract representation further from occipital cortex. So we have a lot to do with this. This is very preliminary, but okay, let me close by just mentioning two things very briefly. One is, many of you are maybe familiar with this. We've been using, for a while now, we developed this technique for keeping people still during MRI scans. We call them head cases. They're like custom manufactured 3D helmets that are based on a laser scan of each person's head. This is what we use to try to get better data quality, and it seems to work quite well. And I know that folks here are using them as well. So maybe I don't need to push you on this, but if you're interested, you should check it out. And two, all the visualizations that I showed you today are made with this visualization package called PyCortex that we made in the Gallant lab. It's mostly James Gao who developed this. He's a very talented programmer. It's really fun. It makes very pretty pictures. So if you're interested, you should check that out too. And I just want to close by thanking all the people that are involved in this, especially Jerry Tang, who's a grad student in my lab at UT, who's been working on the visual grounding work that you saw today. Thank you. That's a good question. I've had with a couple people about like whether this is an appropriate thing to do. We had a problem with the data set in the lab that I wasn't involved in where there was an attempt to the distribution of categories in that data set because they had a problem where natural images, and the images tended to either contain people or animals, but there were very few images that contained people and animals. So they added a bunch of images that contained people and animals to the data set. And they had a problem because those were weird images. They ended up being lower probability images in the grand scheme of things, and that ended up biasing the models in pretty strange ways. So there were a lot of images of like people holding fish, because it turns out that that's a common genre of images that contain people and animals. And a lot of the brains seem to respond a lot to people holding fish because that was this weirdly sort of singular category that even though it's a low probability, way overrepresented in this data set compared to what it should be. So that kind of scared me off, this idea of let's target our sampling. But I'm not sure. Maybe it's a good thing to do. I'm not sure. But in general, like my thought is just sample more. If you want better sampling of a space, just do more stimuli, get more data. Hey.
I was thinking of a more kind of higher level perspective. There also there's one aspect of meaning. Meaning is a kind of a vast realm. We're looking more like a noun, a position of noun somehow. I was sort of thinking there are aspects of language, the structure of meaning, like functionality, compositionality, sentence structure, disjunctions. You don't have a kind of any kind of thing related to a disjunction.